Okay, so chapter 5, we're dealing with communication and language, in particular how it deals with culture. And so if you remember back from chapter 1, one of the subfields of anthropology is linguistic anthropology. And so because it's within cultural anthropology, we'll spend a little time talking about communication and language. And if you remember, it's the most powerful transmitter of culture. And so culture is learned and shared, and it's really through language that we learn our culture, and makes it an important aspect of cultural anthropology. So here's some of the things that we'll talk about. So just the word communication itself derives from the Latin, and it's a verb, and it means to impart, to share, to make common. So just right there, you can see some overlap with culture, because culture is learned and culture is shared, and cultural knowledge is imparted upon someone within that culture. And so when we think of communication, we generally think of verbal communication, but I think the statistics vary from 60 to 90% of our communication is nonverbal. And so we'll look at nonverbal human communication, and then also non-human communication. So there are other organisms that communicate as well, but just most of the time not verbally. Although animals make sounds, they don't make words. So you probably, when you think of non-human communication, the first animal that might pop into your mind is our close relatives, the chimpanzees. They lack a capacity for speech, but chimpanzees and other apes do communicate with hand gestures. And so here's an example of a researcher working with a chimpanzee on non-human communication, which is possible for them. So the origins of language, the origins of spoken language are unknown. So, with written language, we can have an idea of when languages began to be written down based off the physical evidence that's left behind. But with spoken language, it's kind of hard to know when it began. Did it begin with modern humans? Did it begin with one of our ancestors, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk in this chapter about Pidgin and Creole languages as kind of these simple languages that we often theorize were the beginnings of what language was like for humans in the beginning, and then also children's acquisition of language. So pidgins are simplified languages lacking many of the building blocks found in other languages. So we find these pidgin languages amongst groups of people. A lot of times it's, and they can develop into what's called creoles, which a lot of times it's in this subordinate, dominant situation. So one example would be African slaves brought to the southern United States. They come from different cultural backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, and then you've got the slave owner who speaks, let's just go with English, and so a lot of times the slaves who may or may not be communicating with one another based on their own linguistic backgrounds will develop what's called a pidgin, and then turns into a Creole language, which has aspects of their original language, and but incorporates the vocabulary from the dominant person's language. So in that case, the slave owner. So if you remember back, we talked about linguistic anthropology. We broke it down into descriptive linguistics, historical linguistics, and sociolinguistics. We're going to come back to that here in chapter 5, and we'll discuss each of those. So descriptive linguistics, it's where linguists have invented special concepts of methods and concepts and methods of describing language. So again, I gave the example back in chapter 1. So like if you're an English major in school, you're a descriptive linguist. You're looking at things like phonology, so the sounds being made, morphology, the form that the words take and are put together in, and things like syntax. So, example, if you were English major, you're looking at the phonology of English. So again, this is the sounds, and I don't want you to get too bogged down in the details of descriptive linguistics. So, the book will go into things like, morph and phones and those sorts of things. Don't get too bogged down with that. But phonology, basically, we're talking about sounds, and so you've got consonants with a P sound like pop, or short vowels like put, things like that. So this would be an example of the phonology of the English language that a descriptive linguist would be interested in. Historical linguists look at how languages change over time, and they look at basically a family tree of languages. And we'll see that here on the next slide, but languages do change over time. I mean, even within my own, a lot of times we talked about culture change through technology and innovation back in chapter 2. A lot of times when the culture changes, so does the language. So, back in the 60s or 70s, you might hear somebody say groovy, or something like that. I don't know. I was alive in the 70s, but I don't remember a whole lot of it. So anyway, but languages change over time. Well, that's just a short amount of time. The example I gave from the 70s to today. But think about the English language from its beginning until now. So like if you were to read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in its original form, you may be able to pick out little pieces here and there, but you probably wouldn't understand too much of it, even though it was written in English at the time. So historic changes, you can, they'll build these kind of family trees of languages, and where it particular, like here we have English, can be within a category of the Germanic languages, that sort of thing. And again, I don't want you to get too bogged down in this either, but just know that a historical linguist basically know the difference between these. So a descriptive linguist is someone who describes the language, studies the language itself. A historic linguist looks at the history of the language and how it relates to other languages over time. And so you can kind of think of linguistic divergence kind of like, it happens the same way that a lot of times genetic divergence happens, or cultural divergence. And so you might have a group of people that become isolated and brings about a divergence between two speech communities. And over time, so you've got this group of people that speak a language. For whatever reason, they're broken up into two groups. This language is going to evolve differently from this one, but it's going to have the same kind of, come from the same origins. Or, let's say these two start to speak differently, then they come back together. Contact results in greater resemblance, so their languages will start to become similar again. So dialect, a person's dialect is a difference in phonology, morphology, and syntax, but it's not that much of a difference that you still can't understand the person. So you can still intelligently decipher what the person's saying, although they have slight differences in phonology, morphology, and syntax. So if we look at the relationships between language and culture, we can look at cultural influences on language and linguistic influences on culture. So basically the interaction between language and culture. So the book talks about cultural influences on language and brings up the examples for basic words for colors, plants, and animals. and kind of the basic grammar structure. And so the interesting thing here is a lot of times, so you might have a group of people from Africa that have maybe 17 words for the color green, because in their particular, let's say they're hunter-gatherers, and to distinguish between different plants, they need to have these different words for the color green. Whereas we might, we have our primary colors, and basically our idea of green, we have a general idea. Well, the interesting thing between language and thought and culture is based on the number of words that you have for color can actually change your perception on how you see that color. So somebody from that African culture may be able to pick out different shades of green that we, like particular me, in my culture I only have so many words for green. I might not be able to differentiate between those greens cognitively based on my language and just continued practice of doing that, I guess. Many of you have probably heard of the SapirWhorf Hypothesis before, and it's an interesting thought. It's not 100% followed or believed, but it's so here it's saying language is a force in its own right and affects how individuals in a society perceive and conceive reality. So this is the part that kind of gets some people hung up. Is our language really that powerful that it changes the way we perceive and conceive reality? And that's a pretty powerful statement, and pretty interesting statement too, to think that our language actually, because when you think, you're basically talking to yourself, and to talk to yourself, you're using your language and particular concepts that are derived from your language, and if another language has a different way of describing, conceiving of certain realities, then it's going to affect your thoughts on it. So it's an interesting hypothesis. And one example from Australian Aborigines, some don't have the concepts of left and right. They use the concepts like east, west, north, south. So anytime, like I might say, oh, your keys are there to your right, they would say your keys are there to the west. And so that person automatically would know to look to the west, because their language this would be an example of how their language changes their perception or the way that they view the world, because they don't have the words left and right, they just have north, south, east, west. Okay, so sociolinguistics then, so we've got historical linguistics, descriptive linguistics. Sociolinguistics is concerned with the ethnography of speaking, or cultural and subcultural patterns of speech variation in different social contexts. So again, I might speak one way when I'm giving a lecture through video, but if I was just hanging out with friends, I wouldn't speak like this. So it's how your speech changes based on social context. So some of the things that go along with that, the ethnography of speaking or sociolinguistics, would be social status in speech. So as a society, again, it's arbitrary, but we have decided that a certain way of speaking is deemed as intelligent or socially acceptable. And so if you are a rich person, you may most likely speak differently than someone who's poor. So social status often is related to speech and the way we speak, and what we expect from certain people. So if we hear a certain person speaking in such a way, we might think, oh, I bet you they have a lot of money, or I bet you they're real poor, that sort of thing. So, and it's really arbitrary. Again, I'll bring up this phrase, arbitrary but consequential. We have decided as a group of people that this way of speaking is the proper way of speaking. It's the, might be the elite's way of speaking. Completely arbitrary, but consequential, because if you don't speak like that, then somebody may look negatively upon you. Gender differences in speech, so that would be another interest. Do women speak differently than men? Multilingualism and code switching. So multilingualism is just as it sounds, so knowing more than one language. If you go back to SapirWhorf, that might be kind of interesting. If you can speak more than one language, when you're speaking in French, does it make you think differently or act, or behave thoughts, those sorts of things differently than English, that sort of thing. And code switching is common especially during the acculturation process, where so maybe a Hispanic person moves to the United States. You probably heard the term Spanglish before. I think it's even an Adam Sandler movie, but kind of switching back and forth between English and Spanish. It's code switching. So although we don't know the origins of spoken language, we can, based on material evidence, know that written language dates back only about 6,000 years. Now again, there may be maybe eventually we'll find some other evidence that it's earlier than that, but for right now we know that written language is about 6,000 years old. And writing is a powerful thing. So it's, since language is a transmitter of culture, oral traditions are popular amongst groups of people that don't have writing, but with writing you can spread information a lot faster. And so literacy is a major goal of most